Welcome to Retire with Purpose, a show specifically designed to help you maximize your financial confidence in retirement. Casey Weade is the CEO and Chief Visionary of Howard Bailey Financial, a certified financial planner and Wall Street Journal best-selling author. He's your host on Retire with Purpose.
Hey, I'm Casey Weade, and we believe in retirement strategies that are driven by meaning and purpose. Join us this week and every week as we discuss planning for your best retirement, pinpointing your purpose, building a rock-solid financial plan, and unpacking trending topics that could impact your financial future. Welcome to the show. Welcome to Retire with Purpose, the science of retiring with confidence, the art of living with purpose. This is your host, Casey Weade. Joining me, my good friend and co-host, Marshall Johnson, here with me.
Hey.
And this is our opportunity to discuss retirement with you. Whether you're at retirement, in retirement, near retirement, or you're just aspiring for that coveted job optional status, you have found yourself a home. We're going to have a wide-ranging discussion, talking everything, finance, investing, retirement today. We're going to be hitting on 401ks, Roth IRAs, 403bs. We're going to be talking also about gold, and not to mention inflation that comes along with that gold strategy. We're also going to be hitting on a question. Can you retire with a nest egg that's too big? And if your nest egg is too big, what exactly should you do about it? Then we have several featured guests coming on the show that will be discussing the psychological side of retirement. You're not going to want to miss that. We have some special gives during that segment as well. But first off, we're going to be covering an article from our Weekend Reading for Retirees email series. That's one email that hits your inbox every single Friday with 4 articles on trending topics in the financial planning, retirement planning space, all designed to help you make better decisions with your hard-earned dollars. You'll get a quick summary. You can dive deeper if you'd like, along with one of my takeaways. Then we like to spotlight one of those 4 articles on our podcast every single week. We did this with this particular article we're going to share with you in just a moment. If you'd like a link to this article, along with the ability to listen to the full-length discussion and sign up for weekend reading, just go on over to retirewithpurpose.com. That's retirewithpurpose.com, and just click on the podcast tab. This article comes to us from the Wall Street Journal, and it is titled, "If Inflation is Coming, Here is What to Do About It."
Ooh, the big bad wolf there, Casey. Inflation is certainly something that we get a lot of questions about these days. If you look at the headlines, it's all over the place. People are worried. Inflation is coming. What should we do about it?
Well, Marshall, you know that I like to include some articles from time to time that I don't wholeheartedly agree with, especially when they become from mainstream media sources, such as the Wall Street Journal. So maybe you've already read this article, and I think there's some gaps in the article, even though it offers some really quality information. I think the biggest takeaway once you dig into this article is one that the article kicks off with, and that is the interplay of timing uncertainty prevents there being a single simple answer.
Yeah.
There is not a single simple answer to safeguarding your portfolio from inflation, or really determining what the inflation rate's going to be, or will there be out of control inflation? What will the federal government do? We just don't know. And there are some things that you can do to protect yourself in the case we do get the worst, though.
Right. We talk about diversification all the time, right? We don't want all of our assets in one asset class or multiple asset classes. We want to diversify, so when interest rates are low or interest rates are high or taxes are high or taxes are low, you have to have various items in your plan that may do better during different times. That's the whole point of diversification.
Yeah, but that's not what you hear on social media. Hop on social media, and it seems like everyone's yelling buy gold or buy Bitcoin from the rooftops right now. You've got the so-called experts out there that say you got to buy gold, put everything in gold. The answer is just that simple. Well, take this. The price of gold has fallen as inflation doubled this year, 1.3 to 2.6, and the price of gold went down while the inflation rate overall doubled. historically, gold has performed well when inflation is high, but that isn't always the case.
Right.
And I think the trouble with gold is that in normal times, it tends to do significantly less well than stocks, as we've seen over the last decade or so.
Yeah.
And it doesn't provide any income. And that has been the number one thing that you've heard from Warren Buffett time and time again. Why would I want to own all this gold? What am I going to do with it?
Well, and to be fair, he says, similar things about Bitcoin, right? It doesn't do anything. It doesn't produce anything. It's not paying regular dividends, and it's not growing. It's a store of value, and I think that's the point, though.
We hope it's a store of value, and it's only a store of value as long as its underpinning comes to fruition. It's underpinned by the notion that other people believe there's value in gold.
Keep going up.
Other people believe that there's value in Bitcoin. It's vulnerable to anything that threatens that status. And I think you're seeing that with gold over the last couple of years. You're seeing the threat to gold status because of the rush to Bitcoin.
Right.
Now it is called into question. Is it Bitcoin? Is it gold? Well, that does affect demand. That ultimately affects the price of gold and its long-term performance. There's nothing wrong with some gold in your portfolio. I truly believe that makes sense. Is it where I'm going to put all of my assets? Of course not. And most of the gold that we own in our family is because I purchased a ring for my wife and a watch for myself.
Yeah, there you go. Well, and I think that's a great way to look at it too. It's like I get that question a lot. Well, should I put a little money in gold? It's like, sure, take your wife over to your favorite jewelry store and get her something really nice. And so there's your store of value plus your get out of the doghouse pass.
And then we make the transition to commodities. And I think sometimes it's easy to get gold and commodities mixed up. Gold is a commodity.
Sure.
However, when you say commodities, that's a much broader piece of the market than that. We're talking about raw materials. We're talking about copper and oil. We're talking about lumber. These are the things
natural resources
that do rise when prices go up. And commodity prices usually rise the most because it takes a long time to build new capacity to satisfy the demand.
Sure.
And I think where the article gets a little confusing is in this discussion about owning commodities, saying that the only way to own commodities is to buy futures contracts.
Right.
Well, what about index funds?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a way that a lot of people want to attack this sector and try to own commodities. They're going to do so through an ETF or an index fund. Just go to Vanguard. Schwab, any of these places are going to have a commodities index that will track the price, right?
Well, I think it's really important to take that diversified index approach, just as we've seen year to date. Copper and oil up more than 30%, lumber's doubled in price. That is a really concerning thing to be buying right now, especially if you just look at it in a vacuum. You go, well, lumber's up because inflation's going up. Copper and oil are because inflation's going up. But we talked about this last week. Just because we have a lumber shortage doesn't mean, just because we have gas prices going up, that doesn't mean we're necessarily experiencing inflation directly. That could be a factor of the time frame that we've been looking at, the strange economy that we've been in over the last year and a half.
The labor markets, the supply chains, all those things were completely disrupted. So it's helpful to understand too, when an asset like this goes up, just like gold did during various periods of time, it's like, hey, put 5% or 10% in gold or commodities or natural resources. Well, what do you do when they double? Right? Do you hold on? Ray Dalio would say, well, just, it's the forever portfolio. Have so much in gold, so much in stocks. Now people have to think deeply. If your commodity prices double or triple, is it time to take profits off the table?
Absolutely. And then you have the equity portion of your portfolio.
Yeah. Stocks are historically a great edge to inflation.
And I think that the article gets some things right here, some things that are really interesting, right? However, at the same time, it gets something wrong. It shares with us that when prices are rising everywhere, the weaker, less popular companies, they also can price more aggressively, and pricing power becomes less important at that time. So cheap or value stocks in really competitive sectors, such as telecommunications or cable TV, they become more attractive in these environments. So you look for value stocks. But again, value stocks tend to underperform growth stocks over long periods of time. So you can't look at that in a vacuum. You can't just pile everything into value stocks because you're expecting an inflationary environment in the future.
And you'll hear folks reference small cap stocks too. This doesn't give any distinction to small versus large, but oftentimes small caps can outperform during those environments as well.
Yeah, and you have to take a long view again. If you look at historically the best performing inflationary assets, those that have guarded against inflation the best over the last 100 years, number one is real estate. This article doesn't even get into real estate, so completely missed the boat on the number one inflation hedge that exists today, real estate, especially farmland, agricultural land. These things are the perfect inflationary asset. Then you also have U.S. equities. While they have underperformed over the short term during depressed environments because we've had inflation during those environments, over the long term, they have still greatly outperformed inflation. So I would throw into this mix, what's wrong with holding some cash? You might say cash as an inflationary asset. Well, cash can be an inflationary asset because if we experience rapid inflation, we could experience opportunities, and having some dry powder on the sidelines that you could buy in some of those depressed growth stocks gives you a great opportunity to even perform better than inflation by multiples over the long run.
And that's the famous Warren Buffett quote, right? Be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when they're fearful. When they are fearful, it's nice to have some cash on hand to pick up those on sale stocks.
Yeah, then, of course, you have Treasury inflation protection
TIPS.
securities, TIPS, and assets with short duration. I think there's an interesting point that's made in here. 30-year Treasuries, the yield was just about 2.3% when we were recording this. So it went from about 1% to about 2%. So the yield doubled from 1% to 2% over about a year. And that resulted in a 20% price loss in those bonds. This is truly something you have to be cautious of today, which is rising interest rates. And because interest rates are just so low, it can act like a springboard. The lower they get, the faster they can rise. And that can be incredibly damaging to your long-term bond portfolio. But I think what's also interesting is that you can take the other side of this. If you're a homeowner and you own a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, fantastic. That is inflation protection. That's leverage against that interest rate risk. And I think there's almost a double benefit, an arbitrage opportunity you can have if you have a large mortgage. Leverage that house, take out a 30-year mortgage, and reallocate some of those assets to inflationary assets. Now you own a chunk of real estate that has some debt, but it's appreciating due to the inflationary environment we find ourselves in. You have locked in a very low interest rate in a rising interest rate environment, and you can utilize that cash to go reallocate it to places where you can perform even better over the long term. The end of this article shares with us some sort of compromise is inevitable because there's no perfect portfolio that wins big whether inflation appears or not. That's 100% true. And guarding against inflation, it takes risks. It takes the ability for you to stomach some ups and downs in that portion of your portfolio. That's why you can't have everything allocated to risky assets. You can't just be laser focused on safeguarding yourself against inflation because you could get it wrong. Make sure you create a strong foundation for your financial future with emergency funds, guaranteed lifetime income, an estate strategy, a healthcare strategy, a tax strategy, and then we can start defending against some of these outliers, such as inflation, with some of those excess assets that you have that you don't need today. We believe you deserve a secure and independent retirement, and that's why we're offering a complimentary financial review to you right now. For the next 10 callers, you'll meet with an independent financial advisor on our team or through a video meeting from your home, and we'll help you determine how prepared you are to handle things like inflation. How do you allocate your portfolio to best guard against rising, not just inflation, but taxes and healthcare costs? In short, we'll take the guesswork out of financial planning for you. It can take just 30 minutes. So for the next 10 callers that call 866-482-9559 right now, a comprehensive financial review with no obligation. Call 866-482-9559, 866-482-9559. We'll be right back after the short break with questions from you.
You're listening to Retire with Purpose, hosted by Casey Weade and Marshall Johnson. This is Retire with Purpose, hosted by Casey Weade and Marshall Johnson.
Welcome back to Retire with Purpose, the science of retiring with confidence, the art of living with purpose. This is your host, Casey Weade. Joining me, my good friend and co-host, Marshall Johnson, here with me. And this is our opportunity to answer questions from you. So if you have questions, we have answers. It's as easy as this. You can visit retirewithpurpose.com and type your question right there in the little text box, bottom right-hand corner of the screen, or you could shoot us a text at 866 482-9559, 866-482-9559. Just shoot us a text or email us at info@howardbailey.com. We're with the times over here at Howard Bailey. You can contact us any way that you please. If you have things that are keeping you up late at night, you have specific questions or concerns about your retirement, your investments, the future, just shoot us a question and we will get you an answer, and we will ask if you'd like to be featured here on the radio show. And that's what we did with Deb. Deb says, I'm a little overwhelmed by how many accounts my husband and I have. We've moved around a lot to different jobs, and between us we have 6 401ks, 3 IRAs, 2 Roth IRAs, and a 403b, not to mention individual stocks. How do we even begin to consolidate?
And a partridge in a pear tree.
Now the thing is, I
6 401ks,
that's
3
not that
IRAs.
unusual. Hey, Deb, we're sitting here, and it's not unusual to see this. This is not an unusual thing. You might think we're poking fun, but hey, many people have the same. Exact
No, I just thought it was funny how it kind of rhymed. As you said
there
it.
are individuals we run into that have way more accounts than this, right? This is natural.
Well, and I can think of numerous families off the top of my head that I've sat down with, and they need spreadsheets upon spreadsheets to keep track of everything. There's no possible way that they can get a clear look at everything because it's spread out everywhere. And I think this is a common problem, Deb. We're not poking fun at you. It just sounded funny when Casey read it. But, consolidation, that's the key word, right? This is a little bit like doing laundry. Do you like to do laundry? Well, when you get to those socks, I always leave the socks for the end. But you get the socks out and you got to find the matches. You lay them all out and you start to pair them up, right? Do the same thing with your IRAs, the same thing with your 401ks. You can start to consolidate like accounts. But this, Casey, is going to beg the question that there's probably not a good plan in place because each one of these things should have its own purpose.
Well,
right?
it got this way because there wasn't a plan, right? If we don't have a plan, what happens? We go throughout life. Our neighbor tells us to get this. Our nephew becomes a financial advisor. Our uncle ends up passing away, leaves us with an inheritance. And we've got another IRA over here. We left it alone, switched jobs 3 times, leave the 401ks where they're at. There wasn't a plan or on an ongoing basis to say, okay, what is the purpose of this money? What exactly do we want it to do? And that would lead naturally to consolidation, right? We could consolidate all of those 401ks and the 3 IRAs and the 403b, assuming they were all under the same registration, the same ownership. You could end up going from 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 accounts to 1 account. Plus, combine the Roths, there's 1 more account, and you've got 1, 2. You could conceivably only have 3 accounts at the end of this. And then if we strategically convert the IRA to a Roth IRA, now you're down to just 2 accounts. You have the after-tax account and you have the Roth IRAs. And I think consolidation is important, but it shouldn't be overstated. It's important for us to consolidate those things so that we know what we have. Most importantly, know what we have and then why we have it, right? If we first consolidate, and this is the process that we go through with families we work with, we sit down, we evaluate where everything is today, we get those things organized, just like Marshall said, right? We sit down, we look at the laundry, we get things organized, and then we're going to lay out a strategy. And we're going to lay out that strategy before we ever consolidate or implement. Next, we're going to start consolidating so that we can ultimately implement that plan. And once it's implemented, maybe we end up going from 12 accounts down to 4 accounts, and each one of those 4 accounts will have a separate purpose. Now you know this is for emergency emergencies. This is for income. This is for long-term growth. This is for estate planning. This is for my long-term care strategy, my legacy strategy. You break those things out and assign them purposes. So in the end, maybe you still have the same amount of buckets. Maybe you have a few less buckets than you have today, but at least you know what the bucket's there for.
Absolutely. Next up, we've got Ronnie. Ronnie says, Casey, in your opinion, how long of a track record do you need in order to determine if an investment strategy isn't quite working properly?
Yeah, this is a challenging question, and because it really depends, of course. But I would just go back to this. I think it comes down to explanation. Can you explain the underperformance? You sit down with your financial planner, and you walk through the portfolio and say, hey, why is this underperforming? If there isn't a good answer, then it probably means there's not a good process.
Sure.
And good investing requires a good process that you're following in order to make sure you ultimately get good results. I mean, there's going to be periods of time in the market where a portfolio doesn't perform. If we have a diversified investment strategy, you may have some tactical money management. You may have some large cap, some small cap, some international equities. And guess what? International equities haven't performed real well over the last decade. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have some there, because they are underpriced. And historically, including international equities with your overall portfolio has led to long-term outperformance. So you want someone to be able to explain that and show you that they have a process for building that portfolio, for designing that investment strategy, or are they just willy-nilly throwing stuff in a portfolio? I've seen this. There was a practice we were actually looking at buying not long ago, and when we evaluated this practice, I said, "What's your investment methodology?" She said, "I don't know. I just kind of pick things that I think are going to do well. I read some articles here and there, and I bought it." And I said, "Well, how often do you make changes?" "I don't know, whenever I feel like making changes." I set up the portfolio, and I kind of never really look at it again, but I look at all the holdings of all my clients, and I might make some blanket changes. That doesn't give me a whole lot of confidence, right? That is not a process. This is a real thing, that there are investment professionals out there that aren't following a process, that aren't following a methodology. That, in my opinion, Ronnie, is the most important thing. It's not the track record, because things can underperform for 5-10 years at a time. It doesn't mean that should have never been in your portfolio, though.
Right. So I think it's, Ronnie, I would say it goes back to expectations as well. I mean, as Casey mentioned, there's been decades where value stocks outperformed or underperformed growth and vice versa. So you just really got to understand the type of investment that you purchased. But then going back to your expectations, like, what did you expect? What did you, if somebody said, hey, the market's up 5% this quarter, what would you expect your investment to do? And having those conversations, open, honest conversations with your investment professional, is going to help understand whether you're both on the same page or not. I've sat down with individuals that have told me that they're relatively conservative, and they are in uber aggressive portfolios. And I've also sat down with people that have told me they're aggressive, and they're in relatively mild, moderate, conservative portfolios. So everybody has a different take on risk tolerance and on what those terms like aggressive and moderate really mean. So it's about understanding your expectations, your advisor's expectations, and making sure you're on the same page.
Our last question comes from Peter. Old Pete says, what are your thoughts on gold being utilized in a retirement portfolio?
Pete, I hope you caught the first segment, because we dove into gold a little bit there. But understanding gold, understanding why you want to own gold. Sometimes people will call and say, hey, I want to own some gold for inflation. And as we just talked about in the first segment, gold may not be the best inflation hedge. Other people want to use it as a crisis hedge or a store of value. Casey, I know you got a lot of thoughts on.
Well, I mean, some people want to use it as a weapon, right? In the case of total end of days, right?
There
end
you
of
go.
days,
Yeah.
governments fall apart, and now What's the currency? People say, well, I'm going to use gold. You're not going to use gold. It makes a horrible weapon. You can't hurl that at anyone very hard, right? And no one's going to want it. I don't want your gold. What do I want? I want your ammunition. I want your pharmaceuticals.
Your food.
I want your food. I want your land. I mean, those are the things that I think really come in handy if we're talking about an extreme scenario. Mm-hmm. So it's either an extreme scenario or it's an inflation hedge. If it's an inflation hedge, then allocate it as a portion of your portfolio. That there's nothing wrong with that. I own gold in portfolios. I also own gold outside of portfolios, but in very small amounts. Relative to an overall net worth, you have to exercise caution with how much you're going to allocate to any volatile asset. That includes gold. There's two different purposes to own it. As Marshall said, it's gold or a crisis hedge, and then you've got the end of days scenario. And for end of days scenario, you can keep your gold. But if we're talking about inflation, then it is historically not the best inflation hedge. However, it still has made for an inflation hedge as a whole.
Yeah. So understanding its role in the overall portfolio, I don't think there's anything wrong with owning a little bit of gold as long as it has its place in your portfolio.
Yeah. And if you'd like to evaluate how to safeguard your portfolio against inflation, maybe you're ready to consolidate some of those retirement accounts, or you just feel like you have an investment strategy that's not working right now and you want to evaluate or you want a second opinion, then take advantage of our special offer right now for the next 10 callers where you can meet with an independent financial advisor on our team, either in person, through a video meeting from the comfort of your home. We'll walk you through all these pitfalls and deliver to you a written financial plan. It can take just 30 minutes. So for the next 10 callers that call 866-482-9559, right now we're offering a comprehensive financial review with no obligation. 866-482-9559, 866-482-9559. Stick around because after this, we're going to be talking to some experts from across the country on the psychological side of retirement.
You're listening to Retire with Purpose, hosted by Casey Weade and Marshall Johnson. This is Retire with Purpose, hosted by Casey Weade and Marshall Johnson.
Welcome back to Retire with Purpose, the science of retiring with confidence, the art of living with purpose. This is your host, Casey Weade. Joining me, my good friend and co-host, Marshall Johnson, here with me.
Hey.
And some other very special guests. Today, we are going to be highlighting the psychological side of retirement. So beyond the financial preparation, the investment strategies, we're now going to take a look at how to shift your mindset in order to successfully make this major life transition work for you. We have had several guest experts on the Retire with Purpose podcast who have shared incredible insight on not only their own experience entering retirement, but also the scientific research behind why you need to navigate the non-financial side of this life shift as well. We're going to be sharing their wisdom with you today, followed by some awesome giveaways to go along with their discussion. So if you find the information here insightful, stick around to find out how to take your knowledge a step further. You can check out all of these featured episodes in full at retirewithpurpose.com/podcast. Let's get started with our first guest. This is Dr. Robert Della Montagne from episode number 70 of the podcast. Robert is a leading expert on the psychological aspects of retirement and helps people manage the negative, non-financial aspects they can experience post-career in his Retiring Mind series of books. Robert joined the podcast to share the story of his personal and marital struggles after his own retirement. I'm going to let you hear it directly from Dr. Della Montagne. Robert shares his own struggles with retirement and what led him to pursue this area of study right here.
Here I am. I've read all these books about retirement. I'm a psychologist. I'm ready for this. And lo and behold, about 6 months into retirement, I felt awful. I said, there's something wrong with me. There's something psychologically going on with me that I've never experienced this before. And it got worse. And so I decided I was a smart guy. I'm a psychologist. I'll figure this out. So I started doing research on what happens when people retire and what happened to me. And so what I started discovering, I went around and talked to people who had retired. And I found out that retirement is kind of a dirty little secret for a lot of people, because there are a lot of people who are miserable in retirement, but they never tell a word because they're embarrassed about it. They're saying, I should be happy. I've retired. I've had a great career. And now everybody expects me to be living the good life. And I don't feel like I'm living the good life at the present time. So that's sort of my story and what started me down the road to researching this topic and writing the books, The Retiring Mind and Honey, I'm Home.
Yeah, we discussed both of those books on our interview, again, on the Retire with Purpose podcast, and we have a special offer for you right now. We partnered up with Dr. Del Montagne to offer free copies of his book, Honey, I'm Home, How to Prevent or Resolve Marriage Conflicts Caused by Retirement. As you know, this is something that's been brought up with a lot of families that we work with, and it's really the primary reason that we invited Dr. Del Montagne on the show. So if you would like some practical step-by-step actions and insights aimed to help resolve troubling differences that may have been lying dormant in your marriage for years so that you can create a fulfilling life in retirement with your spouse, claim your free copy of Honey, I'm Home by calling us or texting the word HOME, H-O-M-E, to 866-482-9559. Claim your free copy of Honey, I'm Home by calling us or texting the word HOME, H-O-M-E, to 866-482-9559. Next up, we're featuring Dr. Brad Klontz from episode number 131 of the Retire with Purpose podcast. Brad is a clinical psychologist turned financial planner, the founder of Financial Psychology Institute, and an associate professor of practice in financial psychology at Creighton. And throughout his career, Brad has dedicated his time and research to helping individuals achieve mental wealth, which focuses on better understanding how your beliefs around money influence your financial behaviors and how to transform negative financial habits into positive ones. Right now, we're going to spotlight a segment of our interview where Dr. Klontz shared with us how our natural instinct is to not save and why visually picturing our future can help us overcome that.
And so the more specific you can get about what it is you want, the more motivated you are going to be to get it. Because essentially, to save money for the future goes against our wiring as human beings. You're actually asking yourself to do something that is the opposite of how we're sort of wired to behave. And if you think about it, much of our development in terms of our brain and our species and all, and how we look at the world was developed in hunter-gatherer tribes, right? And so this whole concept of sort of hoarding and holding on to things never happened. Number one, you had to share with everybody. Number two, you were mobile, so you couldn't carry a bunch of stuff with you. So you couldn't really acquire a bunch of stuff. And so we're wired to not do that. We're also wired to consume as much as possible right now because you're not sure when there's more coming. And so many of our clients that we're working with have already sort of overcome this natural wiring that people have. And one way to harness to get you to save more or really shift your behavior is to get extremely visual around why you want to do it to begin with. And so what we did in our studies, we've done it a few different ways, but one of the ways we did it is have people essentially imagine themselves in the future. Like, who are you? Who are you with? What are you doing? What are you doing when you get up in the morning every day? How are you feeling? Where are you located? Just getting really, so one way to do it is conversationally, just sort of answering those questions. And then what works even better than that is actually having people create an actual vision, like show it on paper. And so what we did in our studies, we've done it a couple different ways, but one way we did it was to have people either do drawings or cut out paper, magazine clippings. So you can think of like a vision board as being extremely powerful for people. It actually helps you motivate yourself to forego pleasure right now for future benefits, because you have to sort of override that natural instinct.
That's really at the core of our planning, right?
Yeah.
Start with purpose.
Yeah, I love it. I love it.
Next up, we'll be highlighting Dr. Brian Portnoy from the Retire with Purpose podcast, episode number 155, an expert in the world of simplifying money. He is a two-time author and founder of Shaping Wealth. Brian joined the podcast to discuss the emotions that come up when we talk about money, why our finances and our search for meaning and fulfillment go hand in hand, and how we can rescript the narratives around retirement to feel happier at every stage of life. Here, Brian shares with us the importance of having a retirement planning process that not just contains the financial aspects, but also the non-financial aspects of your financial future.
So prior to the investing piece, we need to have a plan. We have to have an articulation of goals and the types of cash flows or lump sum payments that we need to underwrite those goals. But prior to goals is the sense of purpose that we need to get into. The notion of goals is tricky and probably more confusing than people give credit to, because number one, and we know this from a lot of social psychology research, we're pretty bad at predicting what we want in the future. And number two, even when we achieve what we want, the intensity and the duration of the emotions that we expect to feel are much weaker and shorter than we anticipate. So we win the lottery, great, have a big party. A week or 4 weeks later, we're sort of just back to who we were. And so assembling that chain from purpose to goals to plans to investment and other money life decisions is where we need to get people. And you do this for a living. I do it from a slightly different perspective, but this is a skill. And I think we are in a wonderful position to help people have better lives if we bring them along a process and make clear what that process is from the start.
This interview with Dr. Brian Portnoy, episode 155 of the podcast, was one of my favorite interviews, and his book was one of the best books that I have read over the last year or so. And we partnered up with Brian to offer free copies of that book, The Geometry of Wealth, to you here today. This book is all about marrying money with meaning and making informed financial decisions based on your purpose and passions. To get your free copy, just text the keyword GEO, G-E-O, to 866-482-9559. That's 866-482-9559, or give us a call right now. Lastly, we want to feature an episode with Mitch Anthony, the legendary Mitch Anthony, episode number 88. And here he discusses how your attitude towards aging affects your longevity.
It's valuing the years. We disparage those years in our society and basically send this message, well, you're used up at 65. So age is a chronological marker, but old is an attitudinal marker. You don't get old until you decide to get old. And here's an astounding study that came out of Yale. I've been tracking every study that has anything to do with successful aging for the last 25 years. And the most powerful, potent factor in extending good years in life came out of the study in Yale. And it basically said you can add 7.5 good years to your life simply based on your attitude toward aging. So if you have this sort of lamenting, oh, I'm getting old, and oh, here we go, and it's going to kill you. That attitude will kill you.
Wow.
Well, just the other day, I was saying, I've been over and picked up we raised ducks. I went over and picked up one of the ducks' watering jugs. My back felt like about snapped in half. I said, I'm getting old.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to backtrack that and just
Stop it.
Stop saying that altogether. We did partner up with Mitch Anthony, though, to offer free copies of his book as well, titled The New Retirement Mentality to You. In this book, Mitch discusses the new reality today's pre-retirees are facing, including a rocky Social Security system, inadequate savings, and last but definitely not least, what it means to retire on purpose. To claim your free copy of The New Retirement Mentality, call or text the keyword NEW, N-E-W, to 866-482-9559, 866-482-9559. Next up, we're going to be answering a real interesting question. Can you retire with a nest egg that's too big? Too big? Well, if it is too big, you're going to want to stick around.
First-time callers are eligible to receive one in-stock book per request. Limit 1 book per week per household, up to 3 books per calendar year. See full terms at howardbailey.com/terms. You're listening to Retire with Purpose, hosted by Casey Weade and Marshall Johnson. This is Retire with Purpose, hosted by Casey Weade and Marshall Johnson.
Welcome back to Retire with Purpose, the science of retiring with confidence, the art of living with purpose. This is your host, Casey Weade. Joining me, my good friend and co-host, Marshall Johnson, here with me. Here to answer the question, can you retire with a nest egg that's too big? This is an article that came from Kiplinger. We included it in our Weekend Reading for Retirees email series. That's an email that goes out every single Friday with 4 articles on trending topics in the retirement planning space, all designed to help you make better decisions about your retirement. It could be the latest tax strategies, the latest investment strategies, the latest retirement income strategies, or just some good old-fashioned thinking material. And you can find a link to this article and sign up for weekend reading at retirewithpurpose.com. So, Marshall, can you retire with a nest egg that's too big?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've met many of families, and unfortunately, they didn't realize it till they were maybe in their 80s and realized, wow, we got way more money than I think we'll ever spend. We should have done things a little bit differently at the start of retirement.
Yeah, and they'll say, well, I wish we would have spent more younger, or I wish we would have retired earlier.
Yeah, right.
And I think it's most often, I wish we would have just retired earlier. We're really happy that we have more than we need, but I really think we could have retired earlier had we sat down and started working with you sooner. Then we would have retired earlier, but we never really knew what was enough. It just never felt like there was enough.
Yeah.
And now that we've sat down and found out that we actually do have enough to retire, we're kind of disappointed we didn't have this conversation sooner. So if you want to have that conversation, you better give us a call, 866-482-9559. So, Marshall, what's the definition of too big?
Well, I think this article, brings a good opinion to light here when we're talking about, is your nest egg too big? I feel like, Casey, there's a lot of people out there that say, well, enough's never enough. But actually, we can stress test things. We can begin to look at scenarios. A good certified financial planner like Ray Levitri here that wrote this article for Kiplinger, you can actually stress test this, figure out how much you need from a cash flow perspective, make some conservative assumptions, and really stress test it to find out if you have enough.
Yeah, if you've done everything, if you already have all of your bases covered, then hey, you're covered. I think what I most often see is that we don't know that we have all of our bases covered. You don't know that you have all of your bases covered because you just have this one big investment portfolio. Some advisor plugged it into some simulations. You looked at a retirement analysis. They said, yeah, you look good. But then you have this thing in your back of your mind that just eats at you going, yeah, it seems good, but man, it seems volatile. What if the market crashes? I mean, what if we have double-digit inflation? What if we have a major healthcare need that's going to cost $10,000 a month? How are we going to cover that? What if taxes double over the next 10 years? Yes, you have an investment strategy. If you have just an investment strategy, how are you ever going to know if you have enough? Because you haven't systematically eliminated those variables that can give you the confidence to know that it is enough.
Yeah, so this article talks about having a 2-strategy approach. You've got one strategy that's going to take care of all those things you just touched on. A comprehensive strategy gives you all the income you need, whatnot, and then takes care of some of those risks that you aligned. But also, you have a second strategy that may be a little more invested a little bit differently.
Right. You're really just separating out your money that you need today and the leftover money. You're taking what we like to call never money and setting it aside, right? So in our planning process, this would look like us outlining assets for emergencies, setting aside assets to last your income to last the rest of your life, setting aside assets for flexibility should you need to adapt to something in the future, setting aside funds for healthcare, and then this would fall into our legacy bucket. Yeah, this particular article is really just focusing on 2 things, your legacy bucket and the dollars that you need for income. We would broaden that to make sure that you have more of your bases covered, but that's the premise. If you have everything invested in one portfolio, you're probably being overly conservative because you don't need all of those assets, and that means those assets you never plan to use are growing at, say, a slower rate because you're being overly conservative, because you are actually going to leave those assets to someone else. And this article really took me back to years ago. We're talking probably about 10 years ago. I had sat down with a principal who was real aggressive, 100% equity Vanguard funds. And I, sat down with him going, well, you're awfully aggressive. Why are you so aggressive at what is at the time was maybe mid to late 70s? Well, boy, you're really aggressive for your age. You ever hear the rule of 100, right?
Sure.
And he said, well, it's not my money. Yeah. And I said, what do you mean it's not your money? It's your name's on the statement. He said, it's not my money. This is my kids. I don't need any of it.
Yeah.
I'm setting it all aside and investing it based on their time horizon. And that makes all the sense in the world. I think so many advisors don't think about that, though.
Right.
So many times, I had a gentleman come to me that brought me his great aunt's statement. She was like 95 years old, and he said, "This advisor's being way too aggressive."
Yeah, don't you think
and
I
it was
should
probably
get more
like
conservative?
it was probably a balanced portfolio, roughly like a 60-40 mix,
Sure.
right? It wasn't super aggressive, but he said, "Yeah, but she's in her mid 90s." I said, "Yeah, but she doesn't need any of it."
Yeah.
Right? Her time horizon isn't like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Her time horizon, leaving it behind to him, was going to be 30 years. Right. So the time horizon was decades. And if we think about it in that way, then we should be investing those dollars more aggressively based on the time horizon of the individual that's actually going to own the account someday.
Yeah, we used to think of that rule 100 going, well, hey, when you're a kid, you can have 90% in stocks, and then when you're 90, you should only have 10% in stocks. But new research shows that is not the best way to look at it. With longevity, we have to go back. And Michael Kitces has done some research on this, Casey, that would say we can actually get more aggressive after the first 10 to 15 years of retirement. So on the back end of life, you're actually taking on more risk than you did at the start of retirement.
Can you retire with a nest egg that's too big? This is an article that came from Kiplinger. We included it in our Weekend Reading for Retirees email series. That's an email that goes out every single Friday with 4 articles on trending topics in the retirement planning space, all designed to help you make better decisions about your retirement. And you can find a link to this article and sign up for weekend reading at retirewithpurpose.com. And the author of this particular article is promoting this 2-strategy approach by setting aside and giving an example of about $1 million. So let's say you have about $1 million that you're investing for retirement, carving out about $700,000 of that million and satisfying all of your income needs the rest of your life, taking the other $300,000 and setting it aside in a more aggressive portfolio for long-term growth. If you set aside that $1 million to satisfy all your needs and didn't take into consideration your kids and investing more aggressively, you would invest it less aggressively, it would be more conservative, and you would end up with less dollars at the end of your years. In this circumstance, saying that you carve out that $300,000 and set it aside in a more aggressive portfolio, the author says you would end up with somewhere between an extra $400,000 and $800,000 that you would be leaving your heirs if you invested that $300,000 more aggressively rather than investing it conservatively.
Yeah, and I love his assumptions here. He went through and used really low rates of return. He used higher than anticipated inflation. He added on 5 years in a nursing home for the surviving spouse. So he really did stress test things. I love that. I love that approach. It's something similar to what we do day in and day out. But I'm sure you're going to bring up some other things that could have possibly been done with that money rather than just throw it in the market.
Before I get to what I think is a better alternative, I think the key for this strategy to work is really communication. I think you need to make sure your heirs know that you've set aside assets for long-term growth, because you could set them aside for a 30-year time horizon, for their time horizon, and then as soon as you pass away, they say, oh, we need to liquidate all this. And what if they liquidate it when the market's down, right? They need to understand that, hey, this is your retirement money. You cannot touch this portfolio. I've set it up for you to not touch for 10, 20, 30 years.
Sure.
Or put together a trust structure to make sure that comes to fruition.
Did you catch the rule of 110 that they were using in there with the kids' ages minus 110? So he's modifying some rules of thumb, if you will, but essentially just investing it like it's the kid's lifetime, not their own.
Yeah, and in the end, the author recommends you see a fee-only certified financial planner to run your retirement projections using the two-portfolio method. Now, here's where I think alternatives aren't considered. Alternatives are not considered because it's a fee-only planner
There you go.
that doesn't have access to any tools outside of stock-based solutions.
Right.
I ran some numbers. So in this scenario, this is a 65-year-old couple. And if instead of taking that $300,000 and allocating it to the market, we instead allocated that to a life insurance policy, that would have purchased a $1.1 million death benefit. $1.1 million tax-free death benefit, not a taxable death benefit as there would be in the IRA, or potentially foregoing a step up in basis if it was a capital asset, should those rules change. If we reallocated the $300,000 to a life insurance policy, and we could establish that life insurance policy so there's still a liquidity feature so that we can still access that $300,000, which in the illustration that I ran, that's what it would have been. You would have still had access to the $300,000, but in the event of death, which is what these assets are being set aside for, it would have been $1.1 million that would have been added to the estate, which would have ended up with about the same scenario when we're going out in this particular example. The author is going out 25 to 30 years. Well, what if something happens in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? Well, that just means that we're leaving even more with the life insurance strategy over the investment strategy.
More.
And in order for that investment strategy to work out, they do need to live a really long time, or the kids need to have the discipline to sit on their hands. So if you want to make sure you have all the tools at your disposal, if you'd like to sit down with an advisor that can walk you through a retirement strategy, this is what we do when we sit down and work with you. We're going to show you all the different strategies. You might sit down with one advisor that only shows you the market-based strategy. We're going to show you multiple strategies, and you select the one that best fits for you. We have all the tools in the bag. Give us a call right now for the next 10 callers, and we'll show you the toolbox. You can visit with a financial advisor on our team, either in person. You can do it through a video meeting from the comfort of your home, and we're going to help determine how prepared you are to handle whatever retirement throws at you. Rising inflation, rising healthcare costs, stock market crashes, rising taxes. These are all major risks that you face right now. In short, we're going to take the guesswork out of financial planning for you, and it can take just 30 minutes. So for the next 10 callers that call 866-482-9559 or text CONSULT, that's CONSULT, to 866-482-9559, we're going to offer you a comprehensive financial review at no obligation. Again, that's 866-482-9559. We're going to be right back here next week on Retire with Purpose.
You've been listening to Retire with Purpose, hosted by Casey Weade and Marshall Johnson. Investment advisory services offered through Howard Bailey Securities, LLC, a registered investment advisor. Working with Howard Bailey Securities, LLC cannot guarantee investment success or that specific financial goals will be achieved. Certified Financial Planner Board of Standards, Inc. owns the certification marked CFP and Certified Financial Planner in the U.S., which it awards to individuals who successfully complete CFP Board's initial and ongoing certification requirements. Howard Bailey Financial is a registered trademark of Howard Bailey Financial. All rights reserved. Information is not intended to provide specific legal or tax advice. Howard Bailey Financial nor its advisors are qualified to give tax or legal advice. You are encouraged to consult with your tax or legal professional for guidance on your individual situation. This radio show is a paid placement.